Hello, this is Taha.
This is Anaina,
This is Movie Masala.
and we're here to yap at you about films we've watched recently.
And today we're doing.
The Seed of the Sacred Fig by Mohammad Rasoulof.
بعد تو از یه سری اوباشی که تمام مسئلهشون لخ شدن تو خیابونه حمایت میکنی؟
کی میخواد لخ شه؟ من کی از لخ شدن
همینایی که کف خیابونن.
کیا بابا؟
Okay, so do you want to start off with like a basic synopsis?
So basically, it's 2 hours and 47 minutes. The first half of which will break your heart. The second half of it will crush it into pieces by making it run so fast that it cannot stand anymore.
How I described this film was also it took my religious trauma, it molded it into a knife, and then it stabbed me with it multiple times.
Yeah, for me, it took my semi-womanhood and made me so scared and terrified that I was hyper vigilant on my way back home, on a normal route back home in London. And just for context, this film takes place in Iran, majorly in Tehran, and then in another kind of unspecified location. But yeah, it's basically a social commentary, a large overarching social commentary on the current regime in Iran that cracks down on women's rights and kind of through things like surveillance and policing and kind of brutality for protests, etc., etc.
As well as just the religious dogma that permeates through its society, right? As well, like it's also, as much as it is enforced by the state, it is also enforced by the people themselves in certain small ways as well.
By an extremist version of this religion, by an extremist reading of Islam.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think and it's done through this microcosm of this family of father, mother, and 2 daughters. And the father is an investigative judge who's just recently been promoted. And I don't want to give any details away of like individual things because I just want people to see it with like a blank slate like I did, because it just heightens the experience for you so much. But yeah, basically the first half is very realistic. It's based in like real life experiences of people. The second half becomes more surreal and metaphorical, but still could be very much real for a lot of people, I think.
Also, even in that sense, I never necessarily took it in a sense of surrealism, much more just a bit more heightened. It's never like this couldn't happen. Honestly, the way the film establishes these characters, you're like, yeah, I could actually see this happening. And it is very much a metaphor for the state and like just heightened religious extremism in that way as well. So honestly, you could very much view it still from a very grounded perspective, in my opinion. Although some of that then does become a bit heightened, and there were 1 or 2 points where I was like, because it's gone on for that long, I've stopped being terrified and have become a bit like taken aback and like disconnected a bit, and now it's starting to become a bit over the top. But I think that's like for a brief 5 minutes, honestly.
Yeah, I think that over the top is where I make the claims of surrealism. Because that's what basically surrealism is meant to do. Which is like it's meant to take you out of a very realistic scenario by in displacing time, displacing place, things like that. So I think that the length, I know loads of people have been like kind of critical about the length of this film, and especially of the second or third act, however you want to see it. Like you just said it was for 5 minutes, but I've read a bit where it's like it was 30 minutes too long, etc. And I think that's the surrealist part. It's like, no, it makes you sit through it. You have to sit through it to fully experience, this one particular story and to understand just how large and intense and kind of horrifying these scenarios are.
Yeah, 100%. Like, firstly, I want to talk about the acting as well, right? You have Iman, who's like the main judge father character by Mizag Zera. You have Najma, who's the mother by Sohela Golestani. You have Sana, who is Satera Maleki. I'm so sorry if I'm like mispronouncing their names. I'm trying my best. And you have Rizwan, who's Masa Rustami. Honestly, just want to also say that as soon as Sana stepped on screen and just the small little energy, I was like, I know I will like her. It is just that specific energy of like that rebellious little child that I am just so here for, and I know it's so personal to me. I love it. So yeah, it was really good in all of the performances, especially Mizak Zera as Iman. I think you see his evolution into the person he becomes, and you do genuinely feel really scared of him as the film keeps going on. That fear is not present in the start, but it really heightens up as the film goes on.
No, I mean 100%. Like when I was thinking about it, I was like, in the first like half, I fully think he's reasonable. I think he's being much more reasonable than the mother, which I think is kind of what the film is meant to be like. It's meant to be commenting on the fact that children sometimes take for granted their fathers is like absentness and their kind of like calmness or something when they are there, versus being in constant confinement with their mothers who they end up like despising more. But like you're meant to recognize that, but you do feel like you feel he's completely reasonable, and then that switch into paranoia and that switch into kind of insanity is so subtle. But then when he does it, you're like, Jesus Christ. The first time he shouts in this movie is like in the last 45 minutes. And I'm like, whoa, I'm so glad he hasn't been shouting this whole time, because I would have been peeing my pants if he had been.
And I think also the film does so many subtle things, because I think it is Iman's journey throughout the film, which is again that kind of metaphor of this deterioration, right? And I think like one thing that stood out to me that I was really enjoying was in Iman's office, you often see this one hallway shot, and so many times there's these cutouts of individuals of like who are meant to represent the people in power, and they're always presented slightly out of focus and everything. I think aside from like one scene where that change really amps up, and I think that's such a good thing of like these positions of power, these institutions of power, which are constantly ever present around you, watching you, but just barely out of focus. So they're never like fully in the frame to be criticized. And I think that's such a good subtle touch in direction.
Yeah, and I think you've brought up the topic of like setting, and reminds me, the person whose office we see clearly and more of is Gadheri, played by Reza Akhlagiran. And basically in his office, all over his wall, there's pictures of the Ayatollah, which is meant to be this big brother-esque, this
figure,
thing.
yeah.
But in one shot, and this again brings me back to like the religious aspect of it. In one shot, you can clearly make out the Zoroastrian symbol, the Zoroastrian guardian angel. And for like a Zoroastrian such as me, who, we have a long history of Iran having been driven out, Parsis specifically, so Indian Zoroastrians, of having been driven out of Iran. It's just like, oh, okay. So it's not just a religious thing. It's not just Muslim people in Iran who are working in this regime. It's everyone who's working there. And it kind of just, it scares you for a second. Like, it could be anyone. And I think that's what it brings it back down to. So it's not trying to critique a religion. It's not trying to critique faith. It's trying to critique this version of religion and faith that's been extremized to the point that it's totalitarian, authoritarian, and oppressive.
Yeah, its commentary, like you mentioned, is so good, especially like coming from places where you have history, coming from Pakistan, bordering Iran, right? And so many of those conversations and so much of that like atmosphere is something, like I said, it was knife of my own experiences stabbing me, right? I know those conversations. I've been part of those conversations where you're victim blaming, you are being basically propagandized by the state, right? And often it's not even necessarily like when women are being assaulted, women are being like, harmed, and that argument comes up. Religion is used to just basically detract from human rights in so many different ways in these places. And again, you also see the brief moments of humanity, right, that come up while Najma is very like for the state and not for the protests that are happening, right? This film is, just to give a bit more spoilers, I guess, not necessarily, it's primarily set during the 2022 protests with Misa Amini's death that triggered and everything, right? And when her mom is against protesters first, you still see those bits of humanity in her when she like still helps out their friend and like still does those things. That tension between humanity versus being in a position of power and like wanting to have personal security over other people, it also, I think, highlights so well of how these systems establish itself. It's not because everyone fundamentally agrees on the broader ideology. It's because you convince everyone that they themselves are better off in your specific ideology. And because everyone thinks that it's best for them, people don't collectivize, people don't come together to, stand back because they fear for themselves.
That's, I think, the point of the film, which is it's questioning who or what an individual even is in such a society, where there are two kinds of collectives you can be a part of. You can either be a part of the regime, of the authority, the collective that is that, or you can be part of the protesters and that collective. And because it kind of splits you so much in so many different ways with so many different aspects of your life, at the end of the day, it becomes about the person and who that person is and what that person does and how that person reacts, especially with family and context, which is arguably like the closest collective you have. So I think, again, this all comes from research about my dissertation and blah, 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 but which is why it's very interesting to talk about. But I think at its core, that film is questioning what it means to be one person and a family in Iran right now, or like 2-3 years ago.
100%. That sense of collectivism permeates throughout the film. Also, one thing that really I feel helps is the cinematography and the score. Cinematography by Puyan Aga Babai, and music by Kharzad Mahmood. I think the score is really well done. It just permeates throughout this film in such subtle ways. And also this lack of sound sometimes, I think, is very interesting. Like we mentioned at the end, where it's a bit more surreal. They take away that sound that's not there and you sit with it more. But I think there's this constant background noise of protest and everything as well that really permeates. And that's edited really well together with actual videos from protests themselves. And it becomes like pseudo-documentarian in that way as well. And it just really makes it feel so powerful. And the cinematography, I think some scenes are so well done, just showing these characters' isolation at times, showing paranoia at times in such subtle ways. One scene that particularly is in my head is when basically Iman's paranoia starts when he realizes his gun is missing. And just this continuous scene that he goes through while trying to find it. It's so good in how it is shot. And there's so many multiple examples of shots like that. And I think it's not necessarily the film's biggest selling point, but like you see these things and you realize how much they help tie the film together.
And I think what I want to end with is like, this film was made in secret and its director is in exile right now. Mahsa Rostami, who plays Rezwan, Sitara Maleki, who plays Sana, and Nusha Akshi, who plays Sadaf, a side character. They've exiled themselves from Iran. So Hela Golestani, who plays Najme, and Misag Zare, who play Iman, are not allowed to leave Iran. And it just really puts into context just how difficult it would have been to make this film and how much of a miracle it is that it exists.
100%.
And I think like all the nominations it has gotten for like the Oscars and the BAFTAs and this and that should not take for granted, like we did for No Other Land last week. Like I said for No Other Land last week, the actual situation of the people who are involved in making it.
Yeah, 1,000%. And you cannot have a film more authentically made based on, like, again, the experiences of its director, Mohammad Rasoulof, who's also been in exile for, I believe, more than a decade now, right? Like these are stories that are told by the people about the people very much so. And they also provide you with not just necessarily stories, but stories told in their specific manners as well. Like, I feel this was constructed a bit differently for oftentimes how Western films are, where it purely focuses on one part in kind of all of its acts. Like, some of the story just completely goes into the background where it's focusing on, and that's a bit more of a different way it tells that story necessarily. And again, if that doesn't work for you, that's very understandable. Like for me, I did have that thing of like, it felt like it was forgetting, but I also felt that it's just telling that story differently, right? But it's such an authentic way of, again, the people telling the story about the people themselves, and that's what makes, like, that's what this film was one of my most anticipated films of the year, because you genuinely want to like see that experience so represented so genuinely well. Yeah, so that's our thoughts. Please do check out the film. This podcast is produced solely by us. Musical assets by Pixabay. Thank you for tuning in. See you again next time.
Bye bye.